The year 1893 clung to Melrose County, Tennessee, like a shroud of humid air and unaddressed secrets. It was a place where the dense forest pressed against the small, gas-lit towns, and where the air often carried the scent of damp earth and the distant metallic tang of the nearby coal mines. Dr. Alistair Finch was new to this kind of quiet. A man whose career had been built in the sprawling, clamorous hospitals of Boston. He had relocated to Melrose under the guise of wanting a slower pace. Though the reality was a quiet professional scandal, he was eager to outrun. He was the newly appointed physician for the county, a man with a precise mustache, a crisp if slightly worn tweed suit, and eyes that missed nothing. The summer was a sweltering endurance test. The sun beat down, baking the dirt roads into a fine, choking dust that coated everything. The heat, however, was not the most oppressive weight in Melrose. That honor belonged to the Melrose family itself, whose sprawling Gothic revival estate sat on the highest hill overlooking the town. It was a monument to their generational wealth and, increasingly, their generational eccentricity. Alistair first encountered the Melrose situation not through a formal request, but through gossip. The kind of hushed, potent talk that permeated the general store and the single, dimly lit saloon. "It's the little ones," Agnes Peabody, the elderly postmistress, whispered to him one sweaty afternoon, ostensibly discussing the weather while meticulously sorting the mail. The twins, Silas and Eleanor. Alistair, sipping tepid lemonade, raised an eyebrow. "I understand the twins are rarely seen." "Are they ill, Mrs. Peabody? I've received no notification." Agnes leaned closer, her voice dropping to a theatrical hush. "Ill? Worse than that, Doctor. They're withering. I see their nanny, Mrs. Gable, coming into town. She buys the strangest things. Salt, barrels of it. And she orders meat, the finest cuts. But they say the children never touch it. They say—" She paused, savoring the suspense, her eyes darting to ensure no one was listening. "They say the children are being fed ashes." Alistair instantly dismissed it. A small, isolated town, the heat, and a family who kept to themselves. It was a perfect incubator for folk tales and malicious rumor. "Mrs. Peabody, that sounds like a cruel exaggeration. Ashes, as in from a fireplace?" "Ashes, Doctor, from the kitchen stove, mixed with water. A little salt for flavor, they say." Agnes's face was a mask of grave concern. "They are starving them, Alistair. Slowly, and no one can get close enough to prove it." The story, despite its impossibility, lodged itself in Alistair's mind. He had to remind himself he was a man of science, a diagnostician, not a detective seeking out macabre folklore. But the very next day, his professional duty was finally called upon. A crisp, heavy envelope arrived via a uniformed driver from the estate. It was a formal summons from Mr. Julian Melrose, the patriarch. "Dr. Finch, I require your immediate and utmost discretion. My children are unwell. Come prepared for a long consultation." The drive up the winding, overgrown lane to the estate was disquieting. The house was enormous, its dark timber and chipped white paint looking less like a home and more like a decaying institution. The surrounding grounds, once meticulously maintained, were now a wilderness of tall grass and choked gardens. The air here was still and heavy, lacking even the usual sounds of summer insects. Julian Melrose met him in the cavernous, dimly lit foyer. The man was impeccably dressed, but his face was a portrait of strained composure. His eyes, dark and perpetually shadowed, held a profound weariness and perhaps a hint of something darker, defensiveness. "Dr. Finch." Julian's voice was low and resonant. "Thank you for coming. I must stress that this consultation is to remain strictly confidential. My family's reputation cannot endure any further speculation." "My oath requires my discretion, Mr. Melrose," Alistair replied, his voice firm. Now please tell me the symptoms of your children. Are they both exhibiting the same affliction? Julian gestured towards the grand staircase, which seemed to swallow the light. They are peculiar. They barely speak. They are severely undersized for their age, 8 years old. They seem listless. My wife Constance and I have done everything, tried every tonic. The local doctor was useless, offering only simple cures. We need a modern mind, doctor. Someone who understands deep psychological ailments. Alistair was led up to the 3rd floor, where the air grew noticeably cooler and heavier. The hall was lined with faded portraits of door-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow him. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the creak of floorboards. They stopped at a heavy, dark oak door. Julian did not knock. He simply opened it. The room was vast, but sparsely furnished. The twin beds were iron-framed, separated by a wide, empty space. But Alistair's eyes went immediately to the children, Silas and Eleanor. They were sitting side by side on the floor near the window, though the curtains were drawn, allowing only thin slivers of weak light into the room. They weren't playing, they were simply sitting, their knees drawn to their chests. They were small, far too small. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over brittle-looking bones. But what struck Alistair was not their physical condition, which was alarming enough. It was the absolute emptiness of their expression. Their eyes, wide and dark, seemed to look through him, devoid of the normal curiosity or fear a child might display towards a stranger. Alistair knelt a distance away, trying to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. "Hello, Silas. Hello, Eleanor. I'm Dr. Finch." No response. Not a twitch. He turned to Julian. "Mr. Melrose, have they eaten recently?" Julian stiffened slightly. "They are difficult eaters. They reject most food. We feed them what they will accept." Alistair's medical training kicked in, demanding observation. He scanned the room. The children's clothing, though expensive, was ill-fitting. The air in the room, despite its grand size, was oddly stale, and then he noticed it. A smell, subtle but distinct. It wasn't a smell of sickness or decay. It was a dry, slightly bitter mineral scent. Alistair frowned, leaning closer to the floor where the twins sat. He subtly inhaled, cataloguing the strange odor. It was the smell of wood ash and raw salt. A cold knot of dread tightened in Alistair's stomach. Mrs. Peabody's macabre tale, dismissed as mere gossip, now hung in the thick, stale air of the room, solidifying into a terrifying possibility. The children's condition, the father's defensiveness, the bizarre smell, it all converged. This was not a physical ailment. This was a case of deliberate psychological abuse, masked as an illness, hidden behind the walls of a wealthy family. Julian cleared his throat, impatience creeping into his tone. "Well, doctor, what is your assessment? What do you propose?" Alistair stood, his professional mask firmly in place, though his mind was racing, already piecing together a strategy. He needed to get closer, to observe the family's dynamics. And most importantly, he needed to find irrefutable proof of what was happening to Silas and Eleanor. He had accepted the slow pace of Melrose County to escape a scandal. Now, he felt a much more horrifying darkness pulling him in. He looked back at the twins, their motionless forms a silent accusation. This was a case that would require more than medicine. It would require cunning, discretion, and courage. The full horror of the Melrose situation was only beginning to reveal itself. "Mr. Melrose," Alistair said, his voice measured, "I propose an extended consultation. I will need to observe the children's daily routine, their diet, and their interactions with the family. I believe this ailment is rooted deeply in the home environment. I will begin tomorrow." Julian gave a curt nod, a flicker of relief, or was it apprehension, in his eyes. "Very well, doctor. Tomorrow." As Alistair descended the grand staircase, leaving the silent, pale children behind, he felt the oppressive weight of the estate. He knew one thing for certain. What he had smelled was the truth of the rumor. The question was no longer if the twins were being fed ash and salt, but why, and who was the true orchestrator of this slow, terrifying torture. The mystery had begun. If you found this first chapter unsettling, please hit the like button and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you don't miss Chapter 2, where Dr. Finch uncovers the first physical evidence of the Melrose's sinister secret. Alistair returned to the Melrose estate the following morning. The humidity had broken slightly, leaving a cool, thin mist hanging over the sprawling grounds, making the house seem even more isolated and spectral. He carried his medical bag, which now contained not just diagnostic tools, but a small leather-bound notebook specifically for observations that fell outside the purely medical realm. Julian Melrose was absent, having left a note instructing the house staff, who moved through the mansion like shadows, avoiding eye contact, to grant Dr. Finch full access. This absence was not a sign of trust, Alistair suspected, but a calculated move to avoid scrutiny. Alistair's first target was the kitchen. It was a massive, antiquated space dominated by a heavy cast-iron stove. The air here was hot and greasy, a stark contrast to the rest of the house. He found Mrs. Gable, the twins' nanny, a woman whose face was perpetually pinched, suggesting a deep, internal misery. She was preparing a tray. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable," Alistair said, adopting an intentionally casual tone. "I'm charting the twins' dietary intake. Could you show me what they eat for breakfast?" Mrs. Gable jumped, startled, clutching the tray. "Dr. Finch, I did not hear you. They only take what they will tolerate, sir. It's a special diet." On the tray were two small, pewter bowls containing a thick, grayish gruel, far too watery to be proper oatmeal. Beside the bowls was a small, crudely carved wooden box containing white crystals, salt, and a small jug of water. Alistair frowned, leaning closer to the gruel. The dry, bitter scent he had identified yesterday was stronger here. "What is this gruel precisely, Mrs. Gable? I need the exact contents for my records." The nanny's face flushed an angry red. "It's a tonic, sir, prescribed by Mrs. Melrose. It's for their digestion. Barley, water, and some strengthening minerals." Her eyes darted toward the iron stove, where a heap of fine gray-white ash lay in the ash pit, much more than was normal for a single night's burn. "And these minerals?" Alistair pressed gently, pointing to the salt. "Just table salt, sir, to encourage them to drink the tonic." Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the tray. "Now, if you'll excuse me, the children must eat before Mrs. Melrose comes down." Alistair knew he couldn't stop her, not yet. Interfering without evidence would simply get him dismissed, and the twins' situation would worsen. He followed her, observing. Upstairs, the twins were exactly as he had left them. Still, silent, their eyes tracking the nanny's movements but holding no flicker of anticipation. "Silas, Eleanor, time for your breakfast," Mrs. Gable announced in a voice that was practiced and devoid of warmth. She held the bowl to Silas's lips. The boy did not open his mouth willingly. Mrs. Gable, with practiced, unsettling efficiency, pinched his nostrils shut. When Silas gasped for breath, she forced a spoonful of the grey gruel into his mouth. The boy swallowed mechanically, without expression, without protest. The same routine was repeated with Eleanor. They were like automatons, conditioned by repeated cruelty. Alistair watched, his stomach turning. This wasn't neglect, it was calculated behavioral torture. The tonic was clearly designed to starve and weaken them, using the ash and salt to create a nauseating, yet survivable substance that would eventually ruin their internal organs. "Mrs. Gable," Alistair interrupted after they had consumed half a bowl each, "I will take over their feeding for the remainder of the day. I wish to monitor their response to direct interaction." The nanny looked relieved. "As you wish, Doctor. They are quite tedious eaters." She quickly retreated. Now alone with the twins, Alistair put his bag down. He took out his notebook, ostensibly charting, but truly looking for anything out of place. He noticed two things immediately. First, the salt shaker Mrs. Gable had left behind was almost empty, suggesting a much higher concentration than a simple flavoring. Second, on the wall, high above the fireplace, where a large oil painting of a fierce-looking Melrose ancestor hung. There was a small, circular smudge on the dark mahogany frame, about the size of a thumbprint. It was out of place, slightly lighter than the polished wood. Alistair walked over, pretending to examine the painting. He lightly touched the smudge. It was gritty. He brought his fingers to his nose. Ash. Why would a child reach that high to touch ash? Or was it the person feeding them? He turned back to the twins. He decided to try a simple human connection. He knelt down, offering a hand. "I know this is difficult, children. I want to help you." Eleanor, who had been staring at the far wall, slowly turned her head. Her eyes, usually empty, settled on him. It was a fleeting moment, but Alistair saw it. A deep, terrified intelligence. A silent plea. Then, she did something truly unsettling. With incredible slowness, she lifted her right hand, her fingers thin and skeletal. She pointed, not at him, but at a specific spot on the iron bed frame of Silas's bed. It was the joint where the headboard met the side rail. Alistair followed the gesture. He had to assume this was not a random movement. He cautiously approached Silas's bed. The joint was secured with a large decorative brass screw. As he knelt, pretending to check the structural integrity of the frame, he noticed the screw head looked slightly scratched, as if it had been repeatedly forced. He pulled a small, sturdy-bladed pocket knife from his vest and slipped the tip into the groove of the screw. It was loose. With minimal effort, he slowly backed the screw out. It was a heavy, 3-inch brass screw. He reached into the hole left by the screw, his fingers searching the dark, narrow space within the iron tubing. His fingers closed around something cold and metallic. He pulled it out. It was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was old, intricately engraved and slightly warm from the metal of the bed. It was hidden, concealed deep within the frame. He glanced at Eleanor. Her expression was once again blank. Her eyes fixed on the wall, but her breathing seemed slightly faster. She was terrified that he had found it. Alistair quickly palmed the locket, slipping it into his vest pocket, then carefully replaced the screw, tightening it as much as he dared with the knife blade. No one would notice it had been disturbed. He looked back at the twins. This locket was not a child's toy, it was a secreted item. What did it contain? A picture? A note? Was this a clue the children had been trying to leave for weeks, knowing the bed was the only place a person might investigate? The appearance of Constance Melrose, Julian's wife, broke the tense silence. She glided into the room, a woman of brittle beauty, dressed in heavy dark velvet despite the lingering warmth. Her eyes were piercing, but her mouth was fixed in a smile that never quite reached them. "Dr. Finch," she purred, her voice sweet and dangerously controlled. "I trust the children are behaving for you." "Perfectly still, Mrs. Melrose," Alistair replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "I've been examining their motor skills and reaction times. I also have a list of questions regarding their past medical history and their diet. I'd like to discuss the specific ingredients of their tonic." Constance's smile wavered. "Oh, the tonic is an old family recipe, Doctor. Quite proprietary. You mustn't trouble yourself over such mundane matters. The focus should be on their minds." She stepped closer to the twins and placed a perfectly manicured hand on Silas's head. The boy flinched, almost imperceptibly, but did not look up. "I believe the mind is irrevocably linked to the body, Mrs. Melrose," Alistair stated, maintaining his ground, "especially when the body shows signs of severe malnutrition. I will need that recipe." Constance stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. The air was thick with challenge. "You are tenacious, Doctor," she finally said, her voice dropping a fraction of a tone. Very well. I shall have Mrs. Gable write down the ingredients, but do not expect any swift miracles. They are complex children. As she left, Alistair knew he had pushed too hard, too fast, but the silver locket felt heavy in his pocket, a burning reassurance that he was on the right track. He had the physical proof now that this was not a simple illness. This was a secret, hidden by the very people entrusted with the children's care. He had to get off the estate and examine the locket. The children were silent, but the locket might speak volumes. The terrifying truth was finally beginning to unfold. Did Eleanor's desperate silent signal send chills down your spine? If you want to see what secrets that locket holds, subscribe now. Alistair drove back into Melrose County, the sun now high and unforgiving, baking the dust. He did not go to his home or his office. Instead, he steered his carriage to the back of the small local library, the quietest place he knew. He was alone in the cramped back room, ostensibly examining medical texts, when he finally pulled out the silver locket. It was heavier than he expected, the silver deeply tarnished, obscuring the intricate carvings of vines and small geometric symbols. He carefully ran a fingernail along the seam. It was tightly shut. He tried prying it open with his pocket knife, but the mechanism was stiff, fused shut by time or deliberate force. He didn't want to damage it. He used a tiny drop of oil from his small medical kit to lubricate the hinge and latch. After several tense minutes of gentle, persistent pressure, he heard a faint click. The locket sprang open. It did not contain a miniature portrait nor a curl of hair. It held two things, carefully folded. The first was a small brittle piece of aged linen cloth. Alistair unfolded it. It was a drawing crudely rendered in charcoal, but undeniably clear. It showed two figures, a tall, severe woman, Constance, and a slender, dark-haired man, Julian, standing over two small stick-figure children. One of the children's faces had a stark black dot over its mouth. The drawing was disturbing, a child's artistic translation of oppression. The second item was a much smaller, thinner slip of paper, not linen, but a piece torn from a ledger, the edges straight. It was covered in tiny, meticulous script, written in faint pencil. Alistair brought it close to the gaslight. It was a list dated about a year prior. October 4th, 1892, 5 lbs, ash, fine sifted, 2 lbs, rock salt, coarse, 1 qt, water, boiled, add belladonna, tincture, 4 drops. Alistair felt a sharp intake of breath, a cold dread far worse than the image of the starving children. Belladonna, deadly nightshade. Even in small, controlled doses, it was a potent poison used to dilate pupils or chronically to induce lethargy, confusion, and a slow, systemic failure. It explained the twins' unnatural stillness, their wide, dark, vacant eyes, and their extreme lack of appetite. They weren't just being starved, they were being poisoned. The ash and salt were not just a cruel deterrent or a form of behavioral conditioning. They were a bitter mask, a disgusting filler to disguise the slow, almost undetectable effects of the belladonna. It was a horrifyingly sophisticated method of slow murder, a psychological torment layered over a quiet, deadly medical process. The note was clearly not written by the twins. The hand was adult, precise. It was a recipe. Alistair quickly recognized the style of the writing. It was the same elegant, looping script he had seen on the formal letter summoning him to the estate. Julian Melrose's handwriting. The father was the one detailing the poisonous mixture. A wave of nausea hit Alistair. Julian's composed weariness wasn't fear of discovery, but the strain of execution. He carefully folded the slip of paper and placed it back into the locket, securing it deeply in his inner pocket. He now had the medical evidence of a felony, but bringing this information forward immediately would be disastrous. Julian Melrose was rich, influential, and powerful. Accusing him of the slow poisoning of his own children, based on a hidden private note found in a child's secret compartment, would lead to Alistair's immediate dismissal, professional ruin, and the total destruction of the locket as evidenced by Melrose's high-priced lawyers. He needed a witness, an accomplice, someone to confirm the routine. His mind went immediately to Mrs. Gable, the nanny. She was complicit, but she also looked terrified and miserable. Was she a willing participant or a coerced captive? Alistair knew he couldn't confront her at the estate. He had to draw her out. He used the pretext of needing a specialist pharmaceutical order to send an urgent note to Mrs. Gable, requesting she meet him at a small, discreet church outside the main town, promising to discuss her employment and future well-being. He waited in the secluded, overgrown courtyard of the old Bethel church as the shadows lengthened. It took nearly 2 hours, but finally a small dark figure appeared on the road. Mrs. Gable. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder repeatedly. She rushed up to him, her breath ragged. "Dr. Finch, this is highly irregular. Did Mr. Melrose send you? Am I in trouble?" Alistair led her to a dilapidated stone bench away from the road. "Mrs. Gable, I did not come here to discuss your employment. I came here to talk about Silas and Eleanor." Her eyes grew wide with fear. "I don't know what you mean, sir. I feed them as I am instructed. I clean them. I am a good nanny." Alistair didn't mince words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small scrap of paper. He held it so she could see the precise, looping script. "I know this is Julian Melrose's handwriting, Mrs. Gable. I know what's in their gruel: ash, salt, and belladonna." Mrs. Gable's composure completely shattered. She sank onto the bench, her head in her hands, sobbing silently. Oh God, he swore it was a natural tonic. He said it was an old European cure for melancholy, that it was safe. Alistair knelt before her. "Don't lie to me. You are a good woman, Mrs. Gable. I saw the fear in your eyes. When did you realize the truth?" She lifted her face, tears streaking the dust on her cheeks. "The smell, Doctor. The smell of the ash was too strong. And the salt. The amount of salt he had me put in. I started seeing how thin they were getting. And the other nanny before me, Miss Hayes. She asked too many questions. Julian Melrose paid her off, sent her far away. She left me a warning." "A warning? Where?" "Under my mattress. A little scrap of fabric. She swore if I kept my mouth shut, I'd get a large sum when I retired. If I spoke, I'd lose everything, including my life." "Mrs. Gable," Alistair said, his voice hard, "you are an accessory to attempted murder. You must choose now. Will you help me save those children, or will you allow yourself to be dragged down with the Melrose family?" He pushed the note into her hand. "I need you to confirm that this is the recipe used daily, and that Julian Melrose wrote it. I need you to confirm that you have been mixing these ingredients." She looked at the deadly list, then at Alistair, then back at the dark, silent forest. She knew the power of the Melrose name, but she also carried the weight of the twins' silent, starving faces. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's true. The tonic, the ash, the salt, and the drops. I measure the drops myself. I was told it was harmless herbal extract." Alistair pulled out his notebook and a fresh pencil. "I need you to write that down. Everything you just told me. Sign it. Date it. This is the only thing that will protect you, Mrs. Gable. You are my witness." She took the pencil, her hand shaking violently, and began to write, sealing her confession and committing herself to an alliance with the one person who could stop the horror on the hill. Alistair finally had the evidence he needed. Now, he had to figure out why Julian Melrose was slowly killing his own children. The terror had just become personal. With Mrs. Gable's signed testimony secured and the locket's contents safely documented, Alistair knew he could not simply walk into the sheriff's office. The county sheriff, Silas Perkins, was a lifelong friend of Julian Melrose. Any overt move would be anticipated and crushed. Alistair needed more. He needed to understand the motive. Why the slow, agonizing poisoning? Why not a quick end? The only logical answer was to make the children's death look like a slow, natural, and highly documented illness, a psychological malady, to protect the family name and ensure the transfer of their vast estate. The next day, Alistair arrived at the estate with a new demeanor, professional, authoritative, and utterly focused on the psychological cure. He bypassed Julian, who was in his study, and sought out Constance Melrose. He found her in the conservatory, a glass room filled with wilting exotic plants, the air thick and cloying. She was tending to an enormous, sickly-looking orchid with unsettling devotion. "Mrs. Melrose," Alistair announced, "I've reviewed the tonic recipe. I must insist that, for the children's sake, we move them to a proper, supervised clinic. The dosage of the herbal extracts is simply too high, causing extreme lethargy." Constance turned, her expression dangerously calm. "I told you, doctor, the recipe is a family secret, and moving the children, impossible. They are too delicate for travel. They are sensitive. They are failures." The last word was delivered with an acidic finality that hung in the air. "Failures?" Alistair pressed, his voice neutral. Constance dropped the small gardening shears she was holding. The clatter echoed sharply on the stone floor. She looked around the vast, empty room as if confirming they were alone. She leaned in, her eyes intense. "You are a doctor of the mind, are you not? Then you must understand the burden of imperfect lineage," she hissed, her elegant facade cracking. "My husband's family has a reputation for perfection, for contribution. These children, Silas and Eleanor, they are stunted, small, they barely speak. They are too soft. They are weak. They will grow up to be a continuous, festering embarrassment to the Melrose name, dragging down the legacy Julian has worked his entire life to maintain." Alistair stared, appalled by the cold, calculated eugenics of her motive. This was not a crime of passion or greed, but of chilling aristocratic pride. "And poisoning them is your solution to failure?" Alistair challenged, his own calm beginning to fray. Constance gave a delicate, dismissive shrug. "It is a necessity. They are fading gently, exactly as they should. It looks natural, tragic, an unfortunate, unexplainable withering. We mourn their loss, and the family line remains pure." "And Mr. Melrose agreed to this?" "Julian," she said, her lips curling into a scornful smile, "is a coward. He cannot bear to see his legacy tarnished, but he cannot bear to act decisively. He manages the recipe, the details, the administration, to keep his hands clean, so to speak. But the intention, the will to see this through, that is mine." Her chilling confession gave Alistair a critical piece of information. Constance was the driving force. Julian was the meticulous executor, the one who handled the deadly logistics. This confirmed Alistair's suspicion that the note was a logistical checklist, not a passionate journal. Alistair knew he was treading on thin ice. He had to pivot. He had to create a distraction. "If the intention is to preserve the legacy, Mrs. Melrose," Alistair said, adopting a contemplative tone, "then a quick, sudden death would raise suspicion. But a slower process drawn out over years, that suggests a medical puzzle. I can help you with that. I can provide the documentation that confirms their psychological deficiencies, the official scientific cause of death." Constance's eyes narrowed, intrigued. "And what do you require, doctor, for this invaluable service?" "Complete, unsupervised access to the twins," Alistair stated immediately. "I need to observe them in an environment where they feel safe enough to communicate. This room, the parlor, the gardens. And I need a different type of nourishment, a small amount of real food, to chart their body's rejection of it. A true medical anomaly is better than a simple wasting illness." Constance paused, calculating the risk. Having a respected doctor documenting their decline and providing a scientifically plausible final diagnosis was worth the minor risk. "Very well," she agreed, her smile returning, sharp as glass. "You will have 2 hours each day, and they may have 1 small cup of broth. You are walking a dangerous path, Dr. Finch. Ensure your reports are thorough and your discretion absolute. Alistair left the conservatory, his heart pounding. He had bought time. More importantly, he had gained access to a crucial location: the gardens. An open area, less confined, where he might actually interact with the twins, away from the immediate gaze of their parents. He needed to save the children, but he also needed to find the one person who could truly stand up to the Melroses. He needed to find Miss Hayes, the former nanny who had left the cryptic warning. She was the only person with prior knowledge and a clean exit. The truth of the Melrose twins' horrifying situation was no longer about a family secret. It was about a premeditated, chilling conspiracy of pride and poison. And Alistair, armed with a locket, a witness, and a calculated lie, was now standing directly in the crosshairs of a monstrous scheme. He knew he had to act fast before the belladonna took its final, irreversible toll. The next morning, Alistair arrived at the estate with a small flask of warm, nutrient-rich broth, the real food he had secured permission for. He found the twins, still and vacant, in their upstairs room. He spoke to them quietly, ignoring their lack of response, explaining that he was taking them outside for motor skill observation. Leading them into the sprawling, neglected garden was a tactical move. The air was fresher, the light more natural. The twins, though still moving mechanically, showed a faint, almost imperceptible tension, as if the exposure to the outdoors was both frightening and welcome. He sat them down on a stone bench, offering the broth. Eleanor took a slow, deliberate sip. Her eyes briefly closed in a spasm of what seemed like genuine, painful pleasure, quickly masked. Silas refused, turning his face away. Alistair realized the deep-seated psychological conditioning was harder to break than the physical starvation. The children associated real food with danger, and the ash gruel with survival. He didn't press them. He pulled out the locket, holding it where the sunlight caught the faint carvings. "This is very beautiful," he said gently. "Do you remember who gave it to you, Eleanor?" Eleanor's eyes, wide and focused, immediately darted to the large, overgrown wisteria arbor at the edge of the garden, its heavy, dark vines climbing over a wooden frame. Alistair followed her gaze. The arbor was dense and secluded. He had to assume this was another clue. "We will walk to the arbor," he announced, "for exercise. Follow me." He led the two skeletal children through the tall grass. Once inside the arbor, the light was dappled and thin, giving them a sense of privacy. Alistair found a small, rusted iron table tucked beneath the vines. He continued his gentle coaxing. "I know this locket is important. I know who it belonged to. Was it the kind woman who was here before Mrs. Gable? Miss Hayes?" The simple mention of the name caused an immediate visible reaction in both children. Silas, who had been completely unresponsive, lifted a tiny, wasted hand and pointed a finger at the center of the iron table. Alistair bent low, examining the iron. The tabletop was covered in years of rust and peeling paint, but beneath a thick layer of green moss, he noticed faint, erratic scratches in the metal. He carefully scraped away the moss with his knife. The scratches, though faded, formed distinct letters: H, then a small, hastily drawn flower, perhaps a poppy or belladonna, and finally, B. HB. Miss Hayes must have left these initials before she fled, knowing the children would see it, and perhaps hoping someone investigating would eventually find it. But what did the B stand for? Belladonna, or a location? Alistair knew he couldn't waste time on vague initials. He needed Miss Hayes. She was the key witness to the Melrose's long-term plan, the one who could corroborate Mrs. Gable's testimony without the appearance of coercion. He returned the twins inside, settling them in their room before Julian or Constance returned. He spent the rest of the day in his office, using every contact he had to trace a single person, a nanny named Miss Hayes, who abruptly left the wealthy Melrose family in 1892. He used the telegraph office, sending discreet queries to medical and domestic placement agencies in Nashville, Memphis, and even as far as Louisville, Kentucky, where he knew many Southern families sent their staff. He fabricated a story, a debt owed, a small inheritance, to make the search sound mundane. It took a day and a half of agonizing waiting. Finally, a response crackled across the wire from an old colleague in Nashville. Nanny named Beatrice Hayes worked briefly in a doctor's household here. Left suddenly. Family said she was obsessed with secrecy and kept speaking of a dark warning. Last known address was a boarding house near the Belle Meade plantation. Alistair felt a surge of adrenaline. Beatrice Hayes. The B was her first name, and the H was her last. He packed a small bag. He could not trust the telegraph line or the local train station. He knew he had to disappear for a day. He wrote a brief, vague note to the sheriff, claiming a sudden medical emergency required him to visit a sick aunt in Knoxville. He arranged for a discreet, fast carriage, the fastest he could find, and set off on the long, bone-jarring journey toward Nashville. The journey was a blur of dust and frantic urgency. Every mile took him further from the twins, but closer to the one person who could save them. When he finally arrived in Nashville, it was late at night. The city was a smoky, bustling contrast to the isolated quiet of Melrose County. He found the boarding house near Belle Meade, a dilapidated structure with peeling paint and a pervasive smell of stale cooking and coal smoke. The landlady, a stout woman with a suspicious glare, confirmed that Beatrice Hayes had lived there, but had left 6 months ago. "She paid 6 months' rent in advance, doctor," the landlady explained, chewing tobacco. "And she left specific instructions. Said if a man, a doctor, came asking for her, I was to give him this." The landlady reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small, sealed bottle, a common 8-ounce pharmaceutical bottle. It was sealed with heavy wax, and a piece of twine secured a folded note to the neck. Alistair's hand trembled as he took it. He knew the feeling of the heavy wax and the thick twine. It was the same seal used on the Melrose family's personal correspondence. He broke the seal and tore open the note. It was a single sentence written in a shaky hand. "The family has eyes everywhere. The proof is with the Poppyfield doctor in Greenvale, Kentucky." Alistair looked at the pharmaceutical bottle. He held it up to the dim light. It was completely empty, but the message was terrifyingly clear. Beatrice Hayes had been chased out of Nashville, living in fear, leaving a cryptic final message for the one person she knew might eventually come looking, the new doctor. He had followed the trail of ash and salt, and now it led to a new, terrifying location, Greenvale, Kentucky. His journey was not over. The suspense was mounting, and time was running out. He had to trust this final, desperate clue. The journey from Nashville to Greenvale, Kentucky was grueling, taking over 20 hours by carriage and a difficult stretch of train. Alistair Finch felt the weight of his mission pressing down on him, his exhaustion fighting with a desperate urgency. Every hour that passed was another hour the Melrose twins were consuming the deadly, subtle poison. Greenvale was a small, quiet town, unremarkable except for the patches of agricultural land surrounding it. Alistair found a local livery stable and began his inquiries about a Poppyfield doctor. The stable owner, a grizzled, lean man, gave him a long, knowing look. "You mean Dr. Elias Thorne," he said, nodding toward the outskirts of town. "He lives in that old farmhouse out by the river bend. Keeps mostly to himself. Bit of a strange one. He grows those poppy flowers. Says he uses them for pain tinctures. Nobody else around here messes with that stuff." Alistair felt a chilling clarity. The belladonna was a deadly substance, but the poppy was another. Opium. Dr. Thorne was either a dedicated botanist or someone dealing in controlled substances. And the flower drawn on the iron table in the Melrose garden, it was not a belladonna flower but a poppy, a visual plea for help left by Miss Hayes. He found Dr. Thorne's farmhouse tucked away, surrounded by a high, rickety fence. Inside the fence, a large patch of the land was indeed dedicated to a striking field of colorful poppies. Alistair approached the house. It was quiet. He knocked on the heavy wooden door. The man who answered was Dr. Thorne. He was tall, thin, and had the intense, slightly manic eyes of someone who spends too much time alone. He wore an old, faded vest and smelled faintly of burnt herbs and medicinal alcohol. "Dr. Thorne?" Alistair asked, holding out his card. "I am Dr. Alistair Finch from Melrose County, Tennessee. I am here because of a woman named Beatrice Hayes." Thorne's expression did not change. He merely opened the door wider and gestured Alistair inside. The house was a cluttered laboratory, filled with shelves of labeled jars, drying plants, and the heavy scent of distillation. "I expected you, Doctor," Thorne said, his voice quiet and dry. "Beatrice came to me nearly a year ago. She was terrified. She was practically vibrating with fear." "She said you had the proof," Alistair pressed. "The proof that the Melrose family is slowly poisoning their children." Thorne walked over to a high shelf and pulled down a large, leather-bound volume, a doctor's clinical ledger. "I am not a hero, Dr. Finch. I am a man who deals in highly specific herbal medicine, and that medicine must be pure. Beatrice Hayes was my patient, but also my supplier. She brought me specimens of belladonna from the Melrose grounds, claiming she was studying them. She was a meticulous observer, but her conscience finally broke." Thorne opened the ledger. On a dated page, there was an entry in Beatrice Hayes's neat script, accompanied by a small dried leaf pressed flat onto the paper. "October 10th, 1892. Examination of specimen from Melrose Estate, TN. This plant, Atropa belladonna, is being used in a tincture, administered orally to the twins. Estimated dosage administered daily is sufficient to induce chronic anticholinergic syndrome, slow, cumulative neurological damage leading to exhaustion, confusion, and death. I was given this recipe to confirm the deadly dose. I refuse to cooperate. This evidence is a record of their slow murder." Below the entry, Thorne himself had written a small note. "Tincture potency confirmed. The mixture with ash and salt is a cunning method of masking the deadly bitterness of the belladonna. It is a slow, professional homicide." Alistair felt a terrible relief. This was the final scientific proof. Thorne, a respected man in his own strange field, had confirmed the dosage and the effect. He had a meticulous paper trail. "She gave me the note for you, Dr. Finch," Thorne continued, closing the book. "She said she knew the Melrose family would find her if she stayed in Tennessee. She knew they would hire a detective, but she didn't trust the local police. She knew they'd trust a fellow doctor. She left the bottle empty to avoid any legal complication for me, and sent you here, hoping you were as dedicated as she believed. Where is she now?" Alistair asked, his mind already formulating the next steps. "Safe," Thorne replied. "She's working under a new name in a small infirmary far away from Tennessee. But she gave me one more thing. She said Julian Melrose often uses the estate's smokehouse for storing sensitive documents, believing the smoke will deter insects and prying eyes. She said the entire family history, the motive, and the financial plan are hidden there. The motive was clear: aristocratic eugenics, driven by Constance's monstrous pride. The financial plan, however, was the key to making the prosecution stick. Alistair needed to prove the poisoning was also about an inheritance. He now had 3 pieces of critical, cross-referenced evidence. 1. The locket, Julian's handwriting on the poison recipe, Chapter 3. 2. Mrs. Gable's confession, the signed testimony of the nanny who administered the dose, Chapter 3. 3. Dr. Thorne's ledger, the scientific confirmation of the belladonna dosage and its lethal purpose, corroborated by Beatrice Hayes, Chapter 6. "Dr. Thorne," Alistair said, standing up. "I need this ledger entry. I need you to sign a sworn statement and notarize this document. I need the full weight of your professional standing behind this." Thorne nodded. "I will do better. I will travel back with you. I will present this evidence to the proper authorities, not in Melrose County, but in the state capital. We need to bypass the local sheriff. We need state jurisdiction." Alistair looked at the thin, intense doctor. "You are risking everything." "I am a man of science, Dr. Finch," Thorne replied, his eyes burning with conviction. "What the Melroses are doing is an abomination. Let's travel, but we must be careful. If Julian Melrose finds out we're heading to the capital, he will send someone after us. We must move in secret and with incredible speed." The plan was set: bypass local corruption and hit the Melroses with the full, undeniable weight of the law, armed with evidence from Tennessee and Kentucky. But first, Alistair had to get back to Melrose. He had to ensure the children were still alive, and he had to secure the final piece of the puzzle, the financial motive hidden in the smokehouse, before the Melroses realized the game was up. The climax was rapidly approaching. Alistair and Dr. Thorne returned to Tennessee not as a medical pair, but as discreet, separate travelers. Thorne headed straight for the state capital to prepare his notarized statement and alert the state attorney general's office. Alistair returned to Melrose County, slipping back into his role as the concerned, easily manipulated, psychological consultant. The atmosphere at the Melrose estate was noticeably colder. Constance was watchful, her false smile stretched thin. Julian was frequently absent, seemingly making frantic trips to the town bank and his lawyers. They were circling the wagons. Alistair went straight to the twins. He found them even weaker. Silas was barely conscious. Eleanor's eyes, though still tracking him, held a terrifying, pleading dullness. The belladonna was closing in. He had to act now. "I need to adjust their treatment," Alistair told Mrs. Gable sternly, handing her a small vial of his own mixture. A potent dose of stimulants and digestive aids designed to counteract the poison, but which he claimed was a stronger, herbal sedative. "Administer this, and only this, with a small amount of water. Tell Mrs. Melrose it's a new, aggressive treatment for their melancholy." Mrs. Gable, now fiercely loyal to Alistair and desperate to save the children, nodded grimly. That night, under the cover of a thick, drizzling rain that blanketed the estate in darkness, Alistair executed his plan. He had to get to the smokehouse. The smokehouse was a squat, solid brick structure 50 yards behind the main mansion, near the edge of the choked forest. It was secured by a heavy wooden door and a large iron lock. Alistair, dressed in dark clothing, approached cautiously. The smell of old, cured meat and wood smoke was heavy in the air. He had spent the day finding a discreet blacksmith in town, claiming he needed a master key made for his own difficult-to-open cellar lock. The result was a surprisingly effective, if rough, set of lockpicks. The rain was his ally. It muffled the slight scrape of metal against metal. After 5 agonizing minutes, the lock yielded with a sharp click. Alistair slipped inside, relocking the door behind him. He lit a single small oil lamp, shielding the light. The interior was surprisingly organized. Cured hams and sausages hung from the rafters, but the back wall was lined with shelves holding heavy, metal-bound boxes. Safes, not for meat, but for valuables. He moved quickly to the most promising one. A large black tin box secured with a simple lever lock. He worked his fingers on the lever, and after a moment of fiddling, it sprung open. Inside was the financial heart of the horror. The box contained 1. A will and testament, dated 1891, signed by Julian Melrose and Constance Melrose. It explicitly stated that in the event of the untimely death of both minor children Silas and Eleanor, the entire estate and assets would be immediately transferred to a complex, privately held Melrose family trust, controlled solely by Constance Melrose and her brother Alistair Vance. 2. A life insurance policy, for Silas and Eleanor, taken out in 1891, with a massive payout, sufficient to secure the Melrose name for another generation, payable to the family trust. 3. A private ledger detailing all the payments made over the last 2 years. Large sums to Miss Hayes, who was paid off to disappear, and smaller regular sums to Mrs. Gable for domestic discretion. 4. A letter written by Constance to her brother Alistair Vance, dated just last month, expressing impatience. The doctor is poking around. The children are taking too long. When the will is executed, the trust will finally be solvent, and we can be rid of the Tennessee heat and the shame of Julian's weak children. Be ready for the announcement within the fortnight. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying finality. The motive was not just pride, it was cold, hard greed, orchestrated by Constance and her brother, using Julian's shame and the guise of a psychological illness to cover up a multi-million-dollar insurance scam and inheritance scheme. Julian was a willing accomplice to his children's slow murder, driven by his wife and the lure of preserving his family's financial name. Alistair photographed the most critical documents: the will, the insurance policy, and Constance's damning letter. Using a newly acquired miniature camera designed for precise documentation, he put everything back exactly as he found it. As he was relocking the tin box, he heard a sound. Not outside, inside the smokehouse. A slight, dry cough. Alistair froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He slowly raised the lamp, its beam cutting through the hanging meat and the lingering smoke. Lying on a low wooden cot in the corner, covered with a heavy horse blanket, was Julian Melrose. He was pale, unshaven, and looked utterly defeated. He was holding a nearly empty bottle of dark amber liquor. "You found it, Doctor," Julian croaked, his voice thick with alcohol and self-pity. The whole sordid, disgusting truth. The family trust. Constance's pride. My weakness. She did this. All of it. I couldn't stop her. You are complicit, Mr. Melrose, Alistair said, his voice hard, devoid of sympathy. You poisoned your own children for money and status. Julian closed his eyes, tears squeezing out. No, Doctor, I poisoned them to keep them alive. Alistair stared. What? The belladonna dose, Julian whispered. It was Constance's idea, but the salt and the ash, that was mine. It's an old family custom, a ritual. I was told when I was a boy that the ash and salt would keep the bad blood from taking hold. The bad blood that took my sister. Constance was giving them the belladonna to kill them quickly. I added the ash and salt. I thought if they were sick but not dead, the insurance wouldn't pay out. I thought I was protecting them from a quick death by keeping them just alive enough to keep the money away from Constance and her brother. The twist was sickening. Julian was not the mastermind. He was a deluded, cowardly saboteur. He had been slowly poisoning his children, believing he was saving them by ruining the financial payoff, perpetuating their suffering in a horrifying act of familial denial and self-justification. Alistair looked at the weeping, drunk man. He was useless. Where is your wife now, Mr. Melrose? Julian shook his head vaguely. Gone. She took a midnight train to the capital, to see her brother, to prepare the papers. She suspects something. She said she couldn't wait any longer. She's going to activate the will. Yes, Julian mumbled. She's going to declare the children gone. Alistair knew he had to move. Julian's confession had sealed the motive, but Constance was now in a race to execute the final act. He turned and slipped out of the smokehouse, relocking the door, leaving Julian in his alcoholic, self-pitying prison. Alistair was not just a doctor now, he was a detective, a witness, and a rescuer. He had the proof, he had the timeline, and he had a terrifying journey ahead of him. The final confrontation was about to begin. Alistair knew he had to reach the State Attorney General's office before Constance Melrose and her brother, Alistair Vance, could successfully file the paperwork to execute the will and declare the twins legally deceased. Julian had given him a crucial head start. He immediately sent a coded telegram to Dr. Thorne. Melrose has fled. Trust imminent. Meeting immediately. Alistair took the fastest train he could, an overnight express heading directly toward the state capital. The journey was agonizingly slow, filled with the click-clack of the rails and the terrifying mental images of Silas and Eleanor barely clinging to life. He spent the journey meticulously organizing his evidence. 1. The locket and recipe. Julian's handwritten note detailing the ash, salt, and belladonna dose. 2. Mrs. Gable's testimony, her signed, dated confession of administering the mix. 3. Dr. Thorne's ledger, the scientific, medical confirmation of the belladonna's lethal dose. 4. The smokehouse documents, the damning will, the insurance policy, and Constance's letter revealing the financial motive and the conspiracy with her brother. He had everything. He just needed to arrive in time. As the train rattled toward the capital in the pre-dawn hours, a heavy, cold fog settled over the landscape, mirroring the dread Alistair felt. He tried to rest, but the image of the twins' empty eyes and the sound of Julian's weeping haunted him. At dawn, the train pulled into the bustling capital station. Alistair did not take a cab. He ran. He ran the 1.5 miles through the foggy, waking streets to the massive, stone-faced State Attorney General's office building. Dr. Elias Thorne was waiting for him outside the building, shivering in the cold morning air, looking relieved and tense. "They're inside, Doctor," Thorne whispered urgently. "Constance Melrose and a man I recognized from a photograph, Alistair Vance. They arrived on the midnight train. They've been here for an hour, meeting with the AG's head counsel, claiming their children's illness has reached a critical stage and they need the will expedited. They are presenting medical records, falsified I assume, to support their claim. We have to stop them now," Alistair said, handing Thorne a copy of the key smokehouse documents. "This is the motive, the trust, the will, the insurance payout. They planned this for years. They need to believe we don't have this. You go to the AG with your ledger. I'll go to the head counsel with the rest." They moved inside. The Attorney General's office was a monument to solemn bureaucratic power. They were directed to a large conference room on the 3rd floor. Alistair pushed the heavy oak door open. Inside, Constance Melrose was sitting at a large mahogany table, impeccably dressed, a picture of refined, tragic grief. Across from her sat a sharp-featured man, Alistair Vance, who looked like a wealthier, younger version of Julian Melrose. Across the table were 2 serious, unsmiling lawyers, and the Deputy Attorney General, a grave-faced man named Mr. Harrington. Constance looked up. Her eyes met Alistair's, and for the first time, her composure broke. A flicker of genuine panic, raw, ugly and absolute, crossed her face. "Dr. Finch, what are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice losing its cultured edge. "You were supposed to be in Melrose County. This meeting is private. Mr. Harrington, this man is disrupting official proceedings." Alistair walked calmly to the table and placed the stack of documents he had photographed onto the polished wood. He ignored Constance completely, addressing the Deputy Attorney General directly. "Mr. Harrington," Alistair said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "I am Dr. Alistair Finch. I am the attending physician for the Melrose twins, Silas and Eleanor. I am here to inform you that the documents this woman is attempting to file, declaring those children deceased or incapacitated, are part of a long-term, premeditated murder conspiracy." Constance leaped to her feet. "This is insane." "He is lying. He is a disgraced doctor from Boston trying to extort money from my family. Arrest him immediately." Alistair pointed to Constance's brother. "Alistair Vance is the co-conspirator. The motive is the Melrose family trust and a large life insurance payout. I have irrefutable evidence that this woman and her brother have been slowly poisoning the twins for the last 2 years with belladonna, ash, and salt. He pushed the copies of the will and the insurance policy across the table. This is the will that transfers the entire estate to the trust upon the children's deaths. This is the insurance policy that pays out millions. At that moment, the door opened and Dr. Thorne entered, accompanied by a police detective. He walked straight to the table and placed his heavy ledger down. "Mr. Harrington," Thorne announced, "I am Dr. Elias Thorne. I have sworn testimony and scientific evidence that I was approached to verify the lethal dosage of the poison. The children were being slowly murdered. I have the signed testimony from the twins' former nanny, Beatrice Hayes, and the current nanny, Mrs. Gable." The Deputy Attorney General, Mr. Harrington, who had watched the entire exchange in stunned silence, picked up Constance's letter to her brother, which Alistair had placed on top of the stack. He read the final lines. "We can be rid of the Tennessee heat and the shame of Julian's weak children. Be ready for the announcement within the fortnight." Harrington dropped the letter, his face pale. The calculated greed and coldness of the scheme was undeniable. "Constance Melrose," Harrington stated, his voice ringing with authority. "You and Mr. Vance are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted insurance fraud, and obstruction of justice." The police detective moved quickly. Vance, a look of pure, animalistic fear on his face, made a move for the door. The detective tackled him instantly. Constance did not resist. Her body went stiff, her eyes fixed on Alistair, filled with a hatred so venomous it felt like a physical blow. She realized that everything, her legacy, her money, her freedom, was lost, undone by the tenacious doctor from Boston. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of handcuffs clicking into place. The horror was over. The conspiracy was shattered. Alistair did not watch them being led away. He turned to the Deputy Attorney General. "We have the conspirators, sir, but the children are still in grave danger. The poisoning was long-term. We must get them medical attention immediately." Harrington nodded, his professional composure returning. "Doctor, you have done a tremendous service. A state team will be dispatched to the Melrose estate immediately. We will arrange transport and full medical care. Thank you, gentlemen." Alistair and Thorne left the office. The sun had finally burned through the fog, bathing the streets in a clean, sharp light. The long, terrifying chase was over. Now, only the aftermath remained. Alistair returned to Melrose County the next day, not as a suspicious outsider, but under the official authority of the State Attorney General's office. He was accompanied by a team of medical specialists and 2 state detectives. The Melrose estate was secured. Julian Melrose was found exactly where Alistair had left him, still slumped in the smokehouse, having succumbed to a deep alcoholic sleep. He was taken into custody, charged as an accessory and accomplice in the abuse and attempted murder of his children. His deluded self-justification did not negate his crime. Alistair's immediate focus was the twins. Silas and Eleanor were rushed by a special ambulance to the State Children's Hospital in the capital. Alistair was at their side the entire time. The initial medical assessment was grim. The prolonged consumption of ash, salt, and belladonna had caused severe cumulative damage. They suffered from extreme malnutrition, muscle atrophy, and damage to their vital organs. The most alarming effect was the psychological trauma. They remained in a state of almost complete catatonia, barely speaking and showing no emotional reaction to their change in environment. Alistair devoted himself entirely to their care. The physical recovery was slow and required meticulous attention. A controlled diet, specific counter-tinctures for the belladonna, and aggressive nutritional therapy. The psychological healing was harder. They were kept in a specialized, quiet ward. Alistair spent hours simply sitting with them, reading quiet stories, not pressing for conversation, but just being a constant, calm, and safe presence. He discovered that while they rarely spoke to him, the twins still communicated with each other. In soft, fragmented whispers, they referred to the outside world as the Ash, and to the hospital as the Light. One afternoon, a week after their rescue, Alistair brought the silver locket to their room. He handed it to Eleanor. She held it, turning it over and over in her tiny hands. "Do you know who gave you this, Eleanor?" Alistair asked quietly. Eleanor stared at the locket, then finally, her eyes met his. Her voice was thin, reedy, and hadn't been used in months. "Miss Hayes," she whispered. "She was kind." Alistair nodded. "She was. And she saved you. She left the clues because she knew you needed a protector." Silas, sitting beside her, leaned forward. They watched the door. He whispered, a flash of fear returning to his eyes. "The mirror wife." Alistair understood. Constance, who was obsessed with appearances, was the mirror wife, always ensuring the illusion of a perfect family. The small breakthroughs continued. They began to eat on their own, small amounts at first, then with hesitant appetite. They began to play simple games with blocks, always side by side, their bond unbreakable. Alistair's dedication to their recovery was relentless. He had risked his life and his career for them, and he would not stop until they were whole. He coordinated with the State Attorney General, who was building a massive case against Constance, Julian, and Alistair Vance. Constance Melrose, in her jail cell, remained unrepentant, cold, and entirely focused on protecting her image. She claimed Alistair Finch was a disgruntled, failed doctor who had fabricated the evidence and coerced Mrs. Gable. Julian Melrose, in contrast, was broken. He confessed everything, detailing the exact moment Constance pitched the plan, his shameful submission to her will, and his deluded attempt to sabotage the murder with his ash and salt mixture. His testimony, though self-serving, was invaluable to the prosecution. The State Attorney General assured Alistair that the combined evidence, the locket, the letters, the ledger, and the multiple testimonies, was overwhelming. The Melrose name, once a shield of wealth and power, was now a byword for a horrifying, calculated crime. Alistair knew his professional life in Boston was permanently damaged, but watching the faint color return to the twins' cheeks and hearing their tiny whispers of communication gave him a profound satisfaction that no society career could match. He was no longer running from a scandal. He was a savior. The final victory, however, was still to come, the closing of the case and the guarantee of the twins' future. Months passed. The trial of Constance Melrose, Julian Melrose, and Alistair Vance became a national sensation. The story of the wealthy family, the secret poisoning, the belladonna, the ash, the salt, and the children's silent, desperate suffering captivated the country. The rigid, aristocratic facade of the Melrose name crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Alistair Finch, Dr. Elias Thorne, and Mrs. Gable, granted immunity for her cooperation, were the primary witnesses. Alistair's meticulous notes, the locket and the recipe, and Thorne's scientific testimony provided the undeniable proof. Constance Melrose's defense attorney fought viciously, arguing that the children suffered from a rare, unexplainable psychological condition, and that the tonic was a misunderstood herbal remedy. But the damning letter to her brother and the clear financial motive exposed the chilling truth of their greed. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts of conspiracy to commit murder and severe child abuse. Constance Melrose and her brother, Alistair Vance, were sentenced to life imprisonment. Constance remained cold and defiant to the end, never showing a moment of remorse for the torture of her own children. Julian Melrose, due to his full confession, his claim of attempting to sabotage the process, and his visible psychological collapse, received a lesser sentence but was still convicted of manslaughter and severe child abuse, ensuring he would never harm his children again. With the parents convicted, the matter of the Melrose family trust and the children's inheritance was finally addressed. The court dissolved the trust, declaring its purpose to profit from the murder of the children illegal. All of the Melrose assets, including the estate, the wealth, and the insurance payout, were placed into a new court-appointed trust for the sole benefit and care of Silas and Eleanor. The final piece of the puzzle was the children's future. Alistair, now a nationally recognized hero, was appointed as a trustee of the children's new estate alongside Dr. Thorne. Silas and Eleanor, now completely free of the belladonna's influence and recovering physically, were still not ready to return to any kind of normal life. They were placed in a quiet, loving, court-appointed foster home in a completely different state, where they could grow up without the shadow of the Melrose name hanging over them. Alistair visited them frequently. The difference was remarkable. They laughed now, a quiet, shy, but unmistakable sound. They spoke freely, argued over toys, and exhibited the normal curiosity of children. One warm spring afternoon, Alistair sat with them in their new garden. Eleanor was wearing the silver locket on a clean, new chain. "We like the sun here, Dr. Alistair," Silas said, carefully arranging a set of small, painted wooden figures. "It is good, clear light," Alistair agreed. Eleanor looked up at him. "Thank you for finding the light, Doctor." Alistair felt a lump in his throat. He had come to Tennessee running from a minor failure in his past. He left it having confronted and defeated a true, cold-hearted evil, and in doing so, he had saved 2 innocent lives. His practice in Tennessee became dedicated to the mental health and welfare of children, a meaningful career built on the darkest foundation of the Melrose case. The Melrose estate itself was seized and eventually burned down in an accidental fire, widely believed to be the final cleansing act of the community, wiping the memory of the silent torture from the face of Melrose County. The horrifying case of the Melrose twins became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that the deepest, most terrifying evils are not those that wear the mask of the supernatural, but those that operate in the cold light of day, motivated by human greed, pride, and calculated cruelty. The children were free, their nightmares replaced by the promise of a future, and the terror was finally over.